It was in Beijing, on a July night in 1900. From the towering walls and narrow alleys came the din of gongs, the blaring of horns, and that eerie drone of the chants of men convinced they were invulnerable to bullets. Flames licked the sky as churches and foreign buildings on the horizon burned. Inside the besieged foreign legation quarter, a few cramped blocks where Western diplomats, missionaries, and Chinese Christian converts and their families had barricaded themselves, there sits an American woman, and she scribbles these words by flickering candlelight. Some nights and days, the firing has been most frightful. At first, it was the Boxers who attacked us. Now it is the armed Chinese soldiers with their small arms and large foreign guns. The blowing of their horns, their yells, and the firing of their guns are the most frightful noises I ever heard. These were the words penned by Sarah Pike Conger, the wife of the U.S. envoy to China, in a letter dated July 7, 1900. She wrote them as she and hundreds of others endured the infamous siege of Peking. The crisis that gripped her world was part of what foreigners would call the Boxer Rebellion. This was an explosion of violence that pitted impoverished Chinese villagers against foreign armies, and ancient spiritual beliefs against modern weaponry. But what was this Boxer Rebellion? Well, boiled down to its essence, it was basically a popular uprising in North China between 1899 and 1901, led by a secret society of peasant youths who called themselves Yi He Chuan, literally, righteous and harmonious fists. Foreigners, noting their martial arts training and boxing-like rituals, nicknamed them the Boxers. But this was far from a trivial boxing club. This movement became a nationwide convulsion. It was a desperate and ultimately tragic attempt by ordinary Chinese to rid their land of growing foreign dominance and Christian influence. By the dawn of the 20th century, after decades of encroachment by Western powers and Japan, many Chinese felt that their way of life was under existential threat. Foreign missionaries had built churches in the countryside, preaching a new faith, and sometimes obtaining special privileges for converts. Foreign companies had laid railroad tracks through ancestral graves and stretched telegraph lines across fields, symbols of an alien modernity upsetting the traditional feng shui of the land. China's imperial government, the Qing dynasty, had been defeated and humiliated in wars against Britain, France, and Japan. It had surrendered port cities and territory, paid huge indemnities, and ultimately allowed foreigners to live and trade under their own laws on Chinese soil. The common people of northern China watched with mounting anger and anxiety as floods, droughts, and economic hardship struck in the late 1890s. And guess who they blamed? They blamed all these calamities on the foreign intruders and the native Christians who seemed to have forsaken the Chinese gods. And so today we talk about the Boxer Rebellion in great detail. A pretty fascinating part of history, ultimately quite tragic, part of that century of humiliation that China went through. But before we get into it, allow me to welcome you to the channel. Hello to all the newcomers, and hello again to those coming back. A quick reminder that we must acknowledge the reason why this whole channel is adless, ad-free viewing from start to finish. That's because we are supported by those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who donate through the links, and of course those who check out the merch store. Thank you very much for that. All links are available in the pinned comment and video description. But you are just doing your best to support by just being here, I suppose. That's good enough for us. Enjoy the content, give it a like, comment, and subscribe for the algorithm. And, well, with all that being said, away we go. Well, if you didn't pick up on it from the introduction, the 1890s and, well, pretty much the entire 19th century in China was extremely volatile. And it was in this atmosphere that the angry young men who would eventually become boxers began to coalesce in the countryside of Shandong and Hebei provinces. They weren't upper-class men. They came from farming villages, martial arts clubs, and anti-bandit militias. Of course, there was plenty of bandits back then, too. They were peasants, laborers, unemployed youths, ordinary people who came together and found a sense of purpose and hope in the brotherhood that the boxers could provide. Their rituals were a heady mix of traditional folk religion, martial arts, and magic. They practiced swordplay and gymnastics, infused with incantations. Among their ranks were even groups of teenage girls, known as the Red Lanterns, clad in crimson garments. These young women, often barely in their teens, were believed to possess supernatural powers of their own. What powers? Well, villagers used to say that the Red Lanterns could actually heal the wounded, extinguish fires, and get this, probably the best one, fly through the air. Pretty cool, huh? Well, they did not fight on the front lines, though. They didn't send them out, but they just served as spiritual icons and medics for the boxer cause, inspiring the men with displays of fervent faith. To Western observers, the very notion of female boxer devotees added an extra layer of this exotic mystique to the uprising. But for the local communities, their presence was another sign that even the daughters of China were willing to rise up and defend the soul of the nation. Under the spell of those rituals, they believed that their bodies would be protected by divine power. Swords could not cut them. Bullets would simply bounce off them. Their slogan captured their mission. In Chinese, we say, 复秦灭洋, support the Qing, destroy the foreigners. Well, pretty obvious what their mission statement is from that one. Pretty much to uphold the Qing dynasty, while exterminating the foreign devils and their influence. Now, this is kind of interesting too because, well, the Qing dynasty were not Han Chinese. They were Manchus. So technically, they were foreigners in a ethnic sense as well, who had taken over China, but, well, they were the people in power and the people with the big cannons and guns, which they had acquired after the self-strengthening movement, after the losses in the Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion. So the normal peasantry kind of had to put their faith in them. They would choose the Qing dynasty or the foreigners from outside. In either case, it's a rock and a hard place. But unlike earlier rebellions in China's history, the Boxers weren't seeking to overthrow the imperial government. In fact, they saw themselves as fervent loyalists, which is certainly different because, like I mentioned, the Taiping was 100% wanting to overthrow the Qing, and they almost did it. And all those bandits and rebels and all the rest, they were the same too. But this was a rebellion against the outside influence coming in, not the Manchu influence that already existed up in the north. So it wasn't really a priority to crush this rebellion at all. In any case, they wanted to rise up and save the Qing dynasty and therefore China itself from foreigners. They saw that this foreign invention was a threat to their collective future, whether they were Han or Yao or Miao people or Manchu people. This made the Boxer movement a strange alliance of grassroots rage and imperial politics, a kind of peasant insurgency that for a time won the secret backing of the very empress who sat on the throne. We'll get to her later. But let's go back a little bit further, To really understand what happened, you've got to step back into the decades that fertilized the growth of this rebellion. The late 19th century was a period of deepening national crisis for China. We've already mentioned the defeats in the Opium Wars of the 1840s and the Arrow War of the 1850s against the Western powers. The Qing government had been forced to grant foreigners broad concessions after these defeats, all signed off on paper. That's how they got Hong Kong, Macau, a few other treaty ports up and down. Christian missionaries, Protestant and Catholic, established missions across China's interior, converting tens of thousands of local Chinese by offering them education and medical care, but also often intervening in local disputes on behalf of their converts. Many ordinary villagers resented these converts, whom they saw as abandoning ancestral traditions and then receiving unfair protection from foreign powers. Of course, the foreigners would come in saying, "We're here to help you, we're here to give you education, medical care, all the luxuries of the glorious Western world. You just have to throw your entire bloodline under the bus." That's basically the deal. Of course, many people were willing to do that. In any case, they weren't very popular. Tensions in villages sometimes flared up into all-out violence. By the 1890s, anti-foreign riots or attacks on missionaries were on the rise. There was one notorious incident that occurred in 1897 in rural Shandong. Late one night, a band of armed men broke into a missionary residence, and when they got in there, they found two German Catholic priests, to which they sat down, had tea with them, and talked it out politely. No, I'm just kidding. The priests were brutally murdered by the intruders. Now, this incident is called the Juye incident, and it sent shockwaves through the diplomatic circles. As for Germany, they seized on it as a pretext to demand territorial concessions. By 1898, German naval forces had occupied Jiaozhou Bay on the Shandong coast, forcing the Qing to lease them the port of Qingdao and a zone of influence in that province. Now, quick little fact about Qingdao. You might have seen the Chinese beer brand, Tsingtao. Now, that's the old name for it under the Wade Giles pronunciation, but we call it Qingdao these days. That was the first beer brewery in China, and the oldest beer brand in China, Qingdao Beer, started up by the Germans because, of course, they had to start up a brewery as soon as they got there. In any case, to many Chinese, this was a complete outrage, these foreigners carving off pieces of their sacred homeland, and yes, fair enough, it's a little bit rude. It also happened that Shandong was the cradle of a popular martial arts sect and a few secret societies, with a long tradition of sectarian rebels and vigilante militias, dating all the way back to the White Lotus Uprising and other. And in this very fragile environment, anti-foreign sentiment merged with this folk religious fervor. In one village in western Shandong, a dispute erupted when local Christians with missionary backing took over a temple dedicated to the Jade Emperor, a deity in popular Taoist/Buddhist religion. Non-Christian villagers were furious at what they saw as the defilement of their sacred space. Early in 1898, martial arts groups from that area, with colorful names like Plum Blossom Boxers and Red Boxers, not those kind of red boxers, organized a 3-day public ritual for exhibition to reclaim that temple. After elaborate ceremonies and displays of fighting skills, they chased the Christians out and reconsecrated the temple to its rightful god. A victory for the locals this time, but the conflict subsided briefly, all until the cycle of provocation and retaliation began again. You see, later that same year, When the Germans established their foothold in Shandong, the Qing authorities, under pressure from foreign diplomats, tried to clamp down on anti-foreign societies. So, the more cautious members of these groups now began to lay low, while the more zealous adopted a new banner to carry on the fight. Yi He Tuan, the militia united in righteousness, which the Westerners would simplistically call the Boxers. By 1899, the Boxer movement was spreading through the plains of northern China. Small bands of youths roamed the countryside, chanting incantations and performing these strange martial rituals. They targeted the symbols of foreign intrusion: Christian churches, chapels, mission schools, and even the homes of Chinese converts. Armed with swords, knives, and farm tools, and the occasional old musket, they attacked mission stations, burned chapels, and tore down telegraph lines, believing that telegraph wires actually disturbed the natural balance or carried malevolent magic. Railway lines, recently built for foreign engineers, were beginning to get sabotaged all over the place. In the Boxers' view, these iron dragons, as they called them, crisscrossing the land, had angered the gods and brought drought and floods. Indeed, northern China was in the grip of natural disasters at this time. The Yellow River had flooded disastrously in 1898, which it did quite often, but this time was particularly bad, and the following year a severe drought struck. Too much water, then not enough water, then too much water again. Crops withered, hunger loomed. Villagers whispered that the foreign religion's interference with heaven's harmony was to blame. Rumors took hold, too, that Christians were kidnapping children and desecrating temples, or that foreign priests used human organs in their dark rituals. Pretty wild rumors, but wild as they were, such lurid tales found fertile ground in communities already straining under hardship and eager for someone to blame. Not all communities welcomed the Boxers, though. Some villagers had actually benefited from the missionary-run clinics or schools, or simply feared that Boxer agitation would bring punishment from authorities. There were villagers split between Christian and non-Christian families, or between those eager to join the patriotic fervor and those who were urging caution and calm. But in the charged atmosphere of 1899, neutrality became difficult. Anyone voicing doubts could be accused of being a traitor or a friend of the foreigner. Thus, the tide of Boxer activism pulled along even many who might have preferred to keep their heads down. Imperial authorities were of two minds about the developments. Some local officials recognized the danger and the absurdity of the Boxers' claims of magical invulnerability. I suppose there's an easy test to prove that wrong. They tried to suppress the movement, fearing it would provoke Western retaliation, and early clashes did show that the Boxers' charms were tragically ineffective. When Qing troops or local militias confronted bands of Boxers, the latter's swords were no match for modern rifles. In one such incident, in early 1900, a group of Boxers entered a town and demanded the magistrates support their plan to destroy a mission chapel. When he refused, they rioted. They killed a soldier and attacked property. Qing troops eventually repulsed them, killing over a dozen of them. The startled locals who had believed that the guns could not kill the spirit Boxers were quite surprised. If swift punishment had followed, the Boxer movement might have been snuffed out there and then, but the Qing officials often hesitated. You see, some were sympathetic to the Boxers' anti-foreign cause. Others lacked reliable troops to enforce order, or some even feared that too harsh a crackdown would only inflame the popular resentment. As a result, the Boxer movement continued to grow, Each skirmish or execution of a Boxer martyr only added fuel to the fire, convincing more youths that they should take up arms to defend China's honor. But within the Qing imperial court in Beijing, a fateful debate was beginning to rage. The aging Empress Dowager Cixi, de facto ruler of China, had long been suspicious of the foreign guests. She had seized power in 1898 from her nephew, the reformist Emperor Guangxi, foiling an attempt to modernize China along Western lines. But now she faced a very different kind of upheaval. Reports of the Boxer uprisings were pouring in from the provinces. Some of Cixi's advisors, notably Prince Duan and other hardliners, saw in the Boxers a potential asset, a popular force of patriotic young men who could be directed to expel foreigners from China once and for all. Other officials were appalled by the Boxers and warned that encouraging this violent rabble would only lead to catastrophe. One notable skeptic was a high official named Wang Yirong, a scholar who had first alerted the court to the Boxer threat. Oh, and ironically, by the way, Wang Yirong would later gain posthumous fame for his discovery of ancient oracle bone inscriptions. But in 1900 he was a little bit more worried about the present than the past. Well, still, oracle bones are still quite cool. Basically the earliest form of Chinese writing and divination. We did a full video on that if you're interested. Chinese history playlist. You know where to find it. Wang and like-minded ministers argued that, however odious foreign encroachment was, declaring war on all the foreign powers simultaneously, with a peasant militia as the tip of the spear nonetheless, well, that would not be a good idea. The admonitions, however, were drowned out by the war cries of the hawks at court as the crisis began to escalate. And tragically, after Beijing fell to the foreigners, that same scholar official, Wang Yirong, who had pleaded against war, was said to be so heartbroken by China's defeat that he took his own life eventually. His fate symbolized the despair of the patriotic Qing officials who saw disaster unfolding. Of course, he's also likened to the poet Qu Yuan, the one from the old festival who threw himself into the river after his country had fallen. Same kind of thing, a modern Qu Yuan. So by the spring of 1900, the Boxer violence was edging ever closer to Beijing and the foreign hub of Tianjin. Groups of Boxers, sometimes numbering in the thousands, roamed the countryside of Zhili province, which is now modern Hebei province, burning churches and terrorizing Chinese Christians who refused to renounce their foreign faith. Foreign missionaries in outlying stations fled for their lives towards the relative safety of treaty ports. Some who could not escape in time were brutally murdered. In one particular episode, in late June of 1900 in Taiyuan, the capital of Shanxi province, the local governor, a fiercely anti-foreign official named Xiang, invited dozens of missionaries and their families to come to the provincial capital under the pretense of protecting them. But this was a ruse. On July 9th, 1900, Xiang presided over the public execution of 44 foreign missionaries, including women and children, along with many Chinese Christian faithful. A massacre that shocked even some of his contemporaries in China. A Chinese convert named Fei Qihao, who witnessed the ensuing turmoil in Shanxi, wrote that Governor Yu's proclamations effectively legitimized violence. Once he offered rewards for killing foreigners and praised the Boxers as loyal patriots. Quote, "All who enlisted as Boxers were in high favor. It was a time of license and anarchy, when not only Christians were killed, but hundreds of others against whom individual Boxers had a grudge." Personal vendettas and lawlessness flourished under the crimson banner of the Boxers. Meanwhile, the foreign communities in Beijing and Tianjin grew increasingly nervous. Things were not looking good. Devils on the doorstep kind of thing, you know. Diplomatic legations, that is, embassies in the capital, sent urgent pleas to the Qing court to quash the unrest. In late May 1900, as Boxer mobs gathered on the outskirts of Beijing, a small detachment of foreign marines, a few hundred guards from 8 nations, arrived to strengthen protection of the legations. At the same time, however, the Qing court, swayed by the pro-Boxer faction, began to ease off efforts to suppress the Boxers. Imperial edicts started referring to the Yihetuan more benignly, as if they were an official militia. By June, Boxer bands were penetrating the fringes of the capital, and rail and telegraph lines to the coast were severed. The situation was getting out of control. June 10th, 1900, an international relief column of about 2,000 sailors and marines under British Admiral Edward Seymour set out from the port of Dagu and Tianjin, heading up the railway line to rescue those trapped in Beijing. This force, drawn from the navies of Britain, America, Japan, Russia, and other powers, soon found itself in a little bit of trouble. You see, the railway was torn up by the Boxers, and Qing regular troops, who officially were still not at war with the foreigners, began sniping at the column. The Seymour expedition, as it was called, was halted by fierce Boxer attacks and destroyed tracks. After intense skirmishes and significant casualties on both sides, the expedition decided to turn back, eventually retreating to Tianjin by June 26th. The failure of this first rescue attempt further emboldened the Boxers and the faction at court that supported them. Back in Beijing, the foreign legations braced for assault. On June 20th, as violence escalated in the streets, the German minister, the ambassador Baron von Kettler, set out for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, an ill-fated mission. On the way, von Kettler was shot dead by a Manchu officer from a brigade known for its Boxer sympathies. This assassination of a top diplomat sent shocks throughout the city. The next day, June 21st, Empress Dowager Cixi made the momentous decision to side fully with the Boxer rebels. She issued edicts in the emperor's name, declaring a war against the foreign powers. The Qing Imperial Army was now ordered to join forces with the Boxers to annihilate the foreigners in China. The die was cast for a clash with the world's great powers. For the next several weeks, Beijing became effectively a war zone. About 450 foreign soldiers and marines, plus a motley band of armed volunteers, fortified the legation quarter, a small district of diplomatic compounds near the Forbidden City. With them were approximately 500 civilian foreigners, including women and children, and several thousand Chinese Christians who had fled there for refuge. Outside, tens of thousands of Qing troops and armed Boxers surrounded them. Among the Qing forces were the formidable Gansu Braves, Muslim warriors from the northwest, led by General Dongfu Xiang, who eagerly joined the fight with modern rifles and artillery. They, along with the Boxer fighters carrying swords, spears, and a smattering of captured guns, besieged the legation quarter, in what became known as the Siege of Peking, lasting 55 days. Inside the besieged quarter, conditions quickly deteriorated. Shells and bullets whizzed through the trees and slammed into the European-style buildings. By early July, parts of the American and British legation compounds had been set ablaze by Chinese artillery fire. Food and supplies ran low. The defenders resorted to strict rationing, and even contemplated slaughtering their few remaining horses for meat. One young imperial princess, who had been caught in the legations as a hostage, reportedly had her pet dog sacrificed for the stew pot, an indicator of the dire straits. Poor thing. Well, in the stifling summer heat, sanitation and disease became major worries, with so many people crowded in a tiny area. Yet amid all the terror, extraordinary camaraderie and resolve took hold among the diverse group of defenders. Soldiers from different nations fought shoulder to shoulder. Missionary women and diplomats' wives set up makeshift hospitals in basements. Chinese converts, though often treated as second class by the foreigners in ordinary times, now served heroically as scouts, couriers, and laborers digging defensive trenches. Not far away, in another part of the capital, a similar siege played out at a Catholic cathedral, where a bishop and priests protected thousands of Chinese Catholic refugees. They too endured constant assaults by Boxers, but, fortified by volunteers and a staunch faith bolstering morale, managed to hold until they were relieved by the French and Italian forces in August. First-hand diaries and letters from inside the legation quarter give a window into the daily life under fire. Sarah Pike Conger, for example, who wrote of keeping her faith through the constant danger, noting that whenever the enemy's shellfire grew intense, it seemed the Lord's hand intervened to spare them at the last moment. An American mining engineer named Herbert Hoover, a future U.S. president, yes, that one, was in Tianjin with his wife during a similar siege at that city. Hoover took charge of organizing defensive barricades, while his wife Lou volunteered in the hospital and kitchens to aid the wounded and feed the beleaguered. She later laughed off embellished newspaper tales that said that she had stood on the city walls with a rifle. In reality, she quipped her contribution lay much more toward the region of a kitchen and dining room, though she added she would have used a gun if necessary. Outside the walls, the Boxer fighters performed their mass rituals and hurled themselves at the foreign defenses with astonishing courage, but to little avail. The modern rifles and Maxim machine guns of the defenders mowed down wave after wave of attackers. Observers noted that some Boxers truly believed in their invulnerability charms until the very moment of death. Young men chanting incantations and wearing red cloth talismans advanced repeatedly into withering gunfire, shouting that spirit soldiers were protecting them, only to collapse in bloody heaps. Over time, the Qing army troops took over more of the fighting, as it became clear that magic alone was not going to breach the foreign lines. Chinese cannons bombarded the legations, and snipers picked off anyone foolish enough to expose themselves. Yet the siege dragged on, week after week, and the defenders held firm, even as their situation grew more desperate. It's worth noting that not every Qing soldier was wholehearted about the fight. Some Chinese officers, like General Donglu, a close confidant of Cixi but weary of the Boxers, deliberately held back their troops at a critical moment or tried to moderate the onslaught. The besiegers were not a monolith. Conflicting orders and power struggles within the imperial camp sometimes gave the legations brief respites. These nuances, however, were little comfort to those under fire. Beyond China, the Boxer Uprising became a global media event. Throughout the summer of 1900, foreign newspapers were filled with dramatic headlines about the fate of besieged legations. Wild rumors circulated. At one point in early August, newspapers in London and New York erroneously reported that all the foreigners in Beijing had been massacred, triggering outrage and calls for revenge. This false report stemmed from a mixed-up telegraph that was soon corrected. When word arrived that the legation still held out, and that relief force had broken through, public celebrations erupted in many Western capitals. Missionary societies, meanwhile, chronicled the sufferings of their flock in China, stirring waves of sympathy and fresh zeal for evangelism. In short, the crisis was not only a clash on the ground, but also a battle of narratives. Each side was always portraying themselves as the victim and the righteous. Now, unbeknownst to those who were trapped in Beijing, help was on its way, albeit slowly and fitfully. The foreign powers had realized that only a large coordinated expedition could break the siege. So they assembled a second, much larger expeditionary force to relieve the legations. 8 nations ultimately contributed troops: Japan, Russia, Britain, France, the United States, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. They all sent contingents, making this a truly multinational military venture. Japan, having a modern army and being geographically closest, dispatched the largest single force, over 20,000 soldiers, and Japanese officers would later earn respect for their discipline during the campaign. In total, by late July 1900, the Allied relief force numbered around 50,000 men. First, the Allies needed to get Tianjin back, the key port and railway junction, which had also come under Boxer and Qing attack. Fierce fighting took place there in mid-July. In the Battle of Tianjin, July 13th to 14th, combined Allied troops, after suffering heavy casualties, managed to storm the walled city, which was defended by a mix of Qing soldiers and Boxer volunteers. This costly victory opened the path to advance on Beijing. In the northeast, Russian forces seized control of Manchuria during the fighting, a sprawling occupation that went somewhat beyond the coalition's stated aims and planted the seeds for future Russo-Japanese rivalry. In early August, the International Relief Force finally marched on Beijing, pushing up from Tianjin amid searing summer heat. As they approached the capital, they fought scattered engagements with Qing troops and Boxer guerrillas, trying to block their path. Villagers along the route paid a bitter price. Allied units, enraged by sniper attacks and by the tales of atrocities against their countrymen, often torched any village suspected of harboring Boxers. On August 14th, 1900, the foreign armies reached Beijing and launched an assault on the city walls. Different national contingents attacked different gates, and in a bit of competitive zeal, Japanese and Russian troops both raced to be the first to breach the city. By the end of the day, they had succeeded in storming into the inner city. American, British, and other forces fought their way through the streets toward the legation quarter, finally reaching the exhausted defenders and lifting the siege. And so, after 55 intense days, the foreigners and Chinese Christians in the legation quarter were saved from almost certain massacre. Jubilant relief and tears greeted the arriving Allied soldiers. But the Qing imperial court was nowhere to be found. Just before Beijing fell, Empress Dowager Cixi, the emperor, and their entourage had fled the Forbidden City in disguise, heading west into remote exile in Shanxi province. The highest echelons of Qing authority abandoned the capital, leaving it effectively leaderless in the face of foreign occupation. In the days following the city's capture, the victorious Allied armies took control of Beijing and its environs. What ensued was a period of brutal reprisals and rampant plunder. Allied troops combed through the capital, hunting for any remaining Boxer fighters or supporters. Summary executions became a grim routine. Captured Boxer suspects, sometimes identified by telltale red sashes or by informants, were lined up and shot. and when they didn't have bullets on hand, they just beheaded them. Many innocents undoubtedly perished in these purges, as vengeful soldiers often made very little distinction between actual Boxer combatants and ordinary civilians. The looting in Beijing became something of legend. The great palaces and princely mansions were ransacked by soldiers and officers eager for souvenirs and riches. Priceless works of art, silks, jade, porcelain, anything of value was seized. Some commanders attempted to regulate the looting, holding auctions of confiscated treasures to distribute shares among their troops. But most of the stuff was simply just pilfered. The Forbidden City itself, the symbolic heart of the Chinese Empire, was occupied by foreign guards, though Cixi's apartments were largely spared direct sack on orders from high command. Churches that Boxers had desecrated were now ironically used as warehouses for loot gathered by foreign troops. One British eyewitness described how ancient porcelain, gold ornaments, and exquisite silks were piled onto carts as Allied soldiers gleefully claimed their war trophies. The attitude of some Allied commanders left little room for mercy. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, in the notorious speech to his departing expeditionary troops, urged them to show no quarter, invoking the spectre of barbarian invaders. He exhorted them to instill such terror that, quote, no Chinaman will ever again dare to look askance at a German. Rhetoric like that, well, it virtually sanctions atrocities in the name of vengeance. In the countryside around Beijing and Tianjin, foreign armies, especially contingents from Germany, Russia, and France, launched punitive expeditions to hunt down Boxer strongholds. Entire villages were burned when any resistance was met. Far from the eyes of the world's press, these expeditions exacted revenge that often made little distinction between Boxer insurgents and hapless peasants. One German general, von Waldersee, who arrived to take overall command in late 1900, directed a series of sweeps through rural areas that, by many accounts, became indiscriminate punitive raids. The Allies had effectively declared parts of northern China a free fire zone to root out the last vestiges of the Boxers. For Chinese civilians, especially in Zhili and Shandong provinces, the closing months of 1900 were a time of terror. Yet even as the war raged in the north, not all of China was drawn into the inferno. In central and southern China, several influential viceroys and governors refused to join Empress Dowager's call to arms against the foreigners. Officials like Li Hongzhang in the coastal provinces and Zhang Zhidong in the Yangtze region quietly reached understandings with foreign consuls to keep the peace. They sheltered missionaries and protected foreign enterprises in their jurisdictions, disregarding the inflammatory imperial edicts from Beijing. This so-called mutual protection of the southeast meant that Boxer conflicts remained largely confined to the north. But it also highlighted the fractured state of Qing authority. Regional leaders were now making their own decisions, a precursor to the warlordism that would soon overtake China. The Allies, for their part, were content to limit military operations to the northern provinces. By early 1901, organized Boxer resistance had been virtually wiped out, and the Qing government, having fled to Xi'an, was suing for peace. Well, of course, that's not quite where the story ends. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion was formalized in a punitive settlement known as the Boxer Protocol. It was signed in September of 1901 between China and 11 foreign powers. Now, if you think that the terms of the Opium War were harsh, well, these continued the trend. We can say that they were deeply humiliating for China. a staggering indemnity of 450 million silver taels was levied. That's equivalent to around $330 million at the time. It's a crushing sum that would burden the Chinese treasury for decades. Years later, the United States, finding the sum excessive, would refund a portion of its indemnity and use it to fund scholarships for Chinese students in America. A small silver lining that led to the founding of a new college in Beijing, which is Tsinghua University. But the Qing government was ordered to punish leading supporters of the uprising. In effect, the court sacrificed its erstwhile champions to placate the foreigners. Prince Duan, the boxer supporting royal, well, he was banished to remote Turkestan, over in Xinjiang area, basically. Other pro-boxer princes and ministers were either executed or forced to take their own lives on imperial command. The very movement that Cixi had encouraged was now denounced in the court's proclamations as a band of criminals and subversives. Amazing how quickly it all turns around in terms of public sentiment, doesn't it? The public reversals further eroded the Qing's credibility in the eyes of its people. State examinations for civil service were suspended for 5 years in cities where foreigners had been killed, a penalty that was aimed at the local elites. No more climbing the ladder for you lot. The foreign powers secured the right to station troops permanently in Beijing and at key points along the route from the coast to the capital. Chinese forts that had threatened foreign shipping, such as the Dagu forts, were to be demolished. And in one final gesture of apology, China had to erect monuments in honor to slain foreigners. For example, a memorial arch was later built on the site where Baron von Kettler was killed. So for the Qing dynasty, in that century of humiliation, the Boxer debacle was a near-fatal blow. Although the dynasty would limp on for another decade, it never fully recovered its credibility. Empress Dowager Cixi did a remarkable about-face. She embraced a program of reforms, abolishing some archaic practices and promoting modern education, as if attempting to atone for the catastrophe in the eyes of the foreigners. In 1902, after the court returned to Beijing from exile, Cixi even made gestures of reconciliation toward the foreigners. She invited the wives of Western diplomats to the imperial palace, an unprecedented courtesy, and struck up friendly rapport with Sarah Conger and others. Miss Conger, who had once feared for her life under Cixi's watch, wrote with surprise that the Empress Dowager's poise and charm in person was quite something to behold. Well, these acts helped smooth over the diplomatic relations and humanize China's rulers in foreign eyes. Yet such goodwill gestures could not undo the fundamental damage to the Qing's prestige at home. Chinese intellectuals and emerging revolutionaries drew their own lessons from 1900. Many concluded that the Qing court's folly and weakness had nearly brought the country to ruin. Anti-Qing revolutionary leaders like Sun Zhongshan, or Sun Yat-sen as he's also known, portrayed the Boxer episode as proof that the decrepit Manchu regime was incapable of defending China against imperialism or of charting a rational course to modernity. Suppose they go hand in hand, really. You're not going to defend against imperialism if you're not modernized. Or paradoxically, the Boxers, who died trying to save the Qing, indirectly hastened the dynasty's demise, as their failure emboldened those who sought to overthrow the throne altogether. Indeed, a mere 10 years after the Boxer fiasco, the Qing dynasty would be toppled in the revolution of 1911, replaced by the Chinese Republic under the aforementioned Sun Zhongshan. Pretty much every single city in China has a Zhongshan Road, by the way. Well, as for the human toll, That's quite staggering. Precise numbers are elusive, but historians estimate that tens of thousands of Chinese perished in the chaos. At least 20,000, perhaps many more Chinese Christians were killed by the Boxers in 1900 alone, along with several hundred foreign missionaries and their family members. Thousands of Boxer fighters died in battle or were executed in the subsequent suppression. The foreign military forces suffered fewer casualties by comparison, but the psychological impact of the conflict was profound on all sides. Almost every village in parts of North China had a tale of loss from those days, whether a son who ran off to join the Boxers and never returned, or a family that starved after soldiers confiscated their grain. What became of the ordinary participants in this cataclysm, though? Well, in the chaos of the war, many Boxer fighters simply melted back into the countryside. Some went into hiding to avoid punishment. Others drifted into banditry or secret societies, keeping alive the embers of resistance. Ironically, a number of these same patriotic peasants who had fought to defend the Qing would a decade later find themselves supporting a revolution to overthrow them, disillusioned by the dynasty's capitulation. Chinese Christian communities, decimated by violence, gradually recovered under the renewed shield of foreign powers. New churches were built, literally on the ashes of the old. Both the victors and the vanquished carried forward the memory of 1900 as a kind of cautionary tale. And so we can say that the history of the Boxer Rebellion is not just a tale of diplomats and soldiers, but it was one of common people, swept up by tides of belief, fear, and anger. A story of farmers who thought they could call down the gods to save their nation. Housewives and missionaries huddled in barricaded compounds praying for deliverance. Of foot soldiers, too, from 5 different continents, converging on an ancient city and an empire forced to confront its own incompetence. The Boxer Uprising, as it's known in China, the Yihuatuan movement, would later be reinterpreted through various lenses. Early Republican-era Chinese writers often condemned the Boxers as ignorant mobs misled by a fanatical court. But later in the 20th century, especially under the People's Republic, the Boxers' fervor was recast as kind of heroic but misguided patriotism. A spontaneous fight against imperialism that, while tragic and misguided, emboldened the national spirit of resistance. Outside of China, the term Boxer Rebellion long conjured exotic images of kung fu warriors and shadowy secret societies, often informed more by Hollywood films and adventure novels than by the plight of the villages and vicarages that were its true setting. Yet behind the myths and propaganda, the core lesson always endures. When a proud but suffering people found their backs against the wall, they rose up with whatever faith and fury they could muster. And they believed in it, 100%. In the Boxer Rebellion, that meant believing that spirit powers and sheer will could turn back machine guns. A hope that met a harsh reality, but one that speaks to the depth of desperation and yearning in those tumultuous final years of imperial China. The death rattle of a monarchy. And that is where our story ends. The story of the Boxer Rebellion. Pretty fascinating, isn't it? You know, it's all part of that greater apparatus of this century of humiliation. The Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, to a lesser extent the Dungan Revolt. Yeah, the Dungan Revolt wasn't good either, but that doesn't really have the cultural impact as the rest of it. And of course, we end up on the Boxer Rebellion, the Sino-Chinese Wars, which we will get to eventually. We will make a video about the Sino-Chinese Wars soon. with time. If you're really screaming out for it, then tell me in the comments and perhaps we'll prioritize it. In any case, let's then look at the top tier patrons and supporters. We got Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altzakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Pesty Hun, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gail, Emily, Jade, Jake, Demonstow, Mason, John, Magenta, and Dumpster. Thank you so much. Alrighty then. Well, that's it from us from this evening. I hope you enjoyed a bit of Chinese history. And yeah, that's it. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Lots of love to you all, and farewell for now.